On a Saturday morning, Enio suffered a stroke that would change his life forever. Waking up in an unfamiliar and desolate place, he found himself in a terrifying environment of abandonment. As he struggled to find a way out, he faced horrifying visions and a threatening presence that still haunt him today, creating a fear of a possible return. Hello, I'm Marcus, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to Beyond the Life We Live. I hope you feel at home and absorb the lesson from the story we're about to share. While you're here, please like and subscribe to the channel, as it's very important to us and helps us bring new and impactful stories to you. Enio had his life transformed by a stroke. At that time, he was a university student, and on a Saturday morning, he began to feel unwell. Feeling an intense sweat, his voice started to falter, and he became pale and unable to speak. Then he fainted. When he woke up, he found himself in a strange location. At first, everything seemed like a confusing dream. He felt lost, as if he were asleep. But gradually, the situation began to clarify. That's when his mind went into panic, overwhelmed by fear and uncertainty. He looked around, trying to understand the environment, but could only see a type of low vegetation he couldn't clearly identify, perhaps some brush or something similar. The sky was overcast, which only heightened his sense of disorientation. Overcome with terror, the thought of having been kidnapped crossed his mind. He then began to walk desperately to escape and find his way back home. After walking for a long time, Enio finally reached a place where the brush diminished, giving way to something that resembled a street. Moving forward, he was terrified, engulfed by an intense fear that only grew. He continued walking, but nothing changed until darkness began to envelop the place, turning day into night and leaving him even more desperate. It was then that Enio realized something was very wrong. Even though the surrounding environment was different, the street seemed endless. So he started running in a desperate attempt to escape that place. Strangely, he noticed that he did not get tired and did not feel hunger. He only felt a deep and relentless fear, something very unusual for him, as he generally wasn't afraid of anything. Still not knowing where he was or what was happening, the desperation grew so much that at one point he stopped, knelt down, and began to pray, crying intensely. He began to connect the current moment with what he had experienced hours before and started to consider the possibility that he was dead. Then he got up and continued walking for what he believed to have lasted the entire night. Surrounded by disturbing silence with no sound of birds or crickets, the fear was so intense it seemed to dominate every thought and movement. As day began to break, he was still surrounded by the same environment, finding no way out, only trapped in that endless feeling of disorientation and fear. Then he finally spotted something in the distance that seemed to be people, and he immediately started running towards them, desperately seeking help. However, as he got closer, the sight became clearer and more terrifying. The figures on the ground were mutilated in a devastating scene. The stench of decay and the condition of the people made him feel that something terrible had happened. Terrified, he fled from that place, running desperately. Then he realized that although he did not feel hunger and did not get tired, the experience was entirely real. In his perception, about 18 hours had passed through the alternation of night and day, as it happens here. He felt the weight of his body when his feet touched the ground, but did not experience the usual fatigue from running. What he felt was a constant contraction of the muscles due to trembling, without hunger, but with muscle pain. The stench of decay in the environment was different from any smell he knew. After several days of walking and crying, Enio began praying again and asking for forgiveness from God. Then, at a certain moment, he saw a large figure in the distance, about 40 to 50 meters away. Paralyzed by fear, when the entity got close and began to sniff him, he felt a putrid breath. Its presence caused a silence among the people around, as if they were too scared to make any noise. When the being finally moved away, he felt relieved, then cried and prayed while struggling to accept that he was dead. Although something inside him insisted otherwise, the experience was so traumatic that Enio still finds it difficult to remember and talk about that moment. After starting to walk again with the goal of escaping that place, he finally found an enormous structure resembling a gigantic wall. It was so large that Enio couldn't see its end. Entering through an entrance he saw a descent leading to a cave with an opening emitting light. As he approached it, he heard a voice, "Don't go there." Surprised, he realized there was no one around him. Alarmed by the warning, he decided to turn back and not proceed, believing there was something wrong with that place. After some time continuing to walk, he arrived at a place that seemed to be a city. However, upon seeing that the being that had surrounded him earlier was there, he chose not to approach, making that city a mystery to him. It looked like a neighborhood, but with a bizarre and aged appearance. Enio then began to move away from that area and found a beach with dark sea and a bad smell. He walked along it, but the strong odor forced him to leave. He continued walking and walking until he simply blacked out and woke up in a hospital. The first sensation was one of profound relief, knowing he was back in his body. He was thirsty and wanted to ask for water, so he tried to call the nurse, but she didn't hear him. The contrast between the terror he had lived and the reality of the hospital was striking. Because of that, he was grateful to be back, but also exhausted and confused about everything he had been through. Later, he discovered that he had been in a coma for 5 days and realized that the perception of time was the same both in the place he visited and in the hospital. The voice that told him, "Don't go," makes him believe he was dying or near death, as he was in a coma and developed pneumonia while in the hospital. Enio believes the voice might have been a warning not to go further, as he might not have returned if he had gone ahead. Since the experience, Enio has changed his view on life after death. He now firmly believes that life continues beyond physical death and that only the body dies while the spirit persists. Although he did not see God, he is convinced of the existence of a spirit. And although the experience was painful and difficult, it had a positive impact on his life, except for the fact that he still feels fear and insomnia regarding a possible return to that horrible place.